Robert Louis Stevenson, The Hunter's Family, narrated by Howard King. There is quite a large race or class of people in America for whom we scarcely seem to have a parallel here in England. Of pure white blood, they are unknown or unrecognizable in towns, inhabit the fringe of settlements in the deep, quiet places of the country, rebellious to all labor, and pettily thievish, like the English gipsies. Rustically ignorant, but with a touch of wood lore and the dexterity of the savage. Whence they came is a moot point. At the time of the war, they poured north in crowds to escape the conscription, lived during summer on fruits, wild animals, and petty theft. And at the approach of the winter, when these supplies failed, built great fires in the forest and there died, stoically by starvation. They are widely scattered, however, and easily recognized, lootyish but not ill-looking. They will sit all day, swinging their legs on a field fence, the mind seemingly as devoid of all reflection as a Suffolk's peasants careless of politics, for the most part incapable of reading, but with a rebellious vanity and a strong sense of independence. Hunting is their most congenial business, or, if the occasion offers, a little amateur detection. In tracking a criminal, following a particular horse along a beaten highway, and drawing inductions from a hair or a footprint, one of those somnolent, grinning hodges will suddenly display activity of body and finesse of mind. By their names ye may know them, the women figuring as Lavina, Larzania, Serena, Liana, Oriana, and the man answering to Alvin, Alba, or Orion, pronounced Orion, with the accent on the first. Whether they are indeed a race, or whether this is the form of degeneracy common to all backwoodsmen, they are at least known by a generic byword as poor whites or low-downers. I will not say that the Hanson family was poor white, but the name savors of offense. I may go as far as this: they were, in many points, not unsimilar to the people usually so cared. Rufy himself combined two of the qualifications, for he was both a hunter and an amateur detective. It was he who pursued Russell and Dollar, the robbers of the Lake Port stage, and captured them the very morning after the exploit, while they were still sleeping in a hayfield. Russell, a drunken Scotch carpenter, was even an acquaintance of his own, and he expressed much grave commiseration for his fate. In all that he said and did, Rufy was grave. I never saw him hurried. When he spoke, he took out his pipe with ceremonial deliberation, looked east and west, and then, in quiet tones and few words, stated his business or told his story. His gait was to match. It would never have surprised you if, at any step, he had turned round and walked away again, so warily and slowly, and with so much seeming hesitation did he go about. He lay long in bed. In the morning, rarely indeed rose before noon. He loved all games, from poker to clerical croquet, and in the tool-house croquet ground I have seen him toiling at the latter with the devotion of a curate. He took an interest in education, was an active member of the local school board, and when I was there he had recently lost the schoolhouse key. His wagon was broken, but it never seemed to occur to him to mend it. Like all truly idle people, he had an artistic eye. He chose the print stuff for his wife's dresses and counselled her in the making of a patchwork kilt, always, as she thought, wrongly, but to the more educated eye, always with bizarre and admirable taste, the taste of an Indian. With all this, he was a perfect, unoffending gentleman in word and act. Take his clay pipe from him, and he was fit for any society but that of fools. Quiet as he was, there burned deep, permanent excitement in his dark blue eyes. And when this grave man smiled, it was like sunshine in a shady place. Mrs. Hanson, nay, if you please, Lovelands, was more commonplace than her lord. She was a comely woman, too, plump, fair-coloured, with wonderful white teeth, and in her print dresses, chosen by Rufie, and with a large sunbonnet shading her valued complexion, made, I assure you, a very agreeable figure. But she was on the surface what there was of her outspoken and loud-spoken. Her noisy laughter had none of the charm of one of Hanson's rare, slow-spreading smiles. There was no reticence, no mystery, no manner about the woman. She was a first-class dairymaid, but her husband was an unknown quantity, between the savage and the nobleman. She was often in and out with us, merry and healthy and fair. He came far seldom, only indeed when there was a business, or now and again to pay a visit of ceremony, brushed up for the occasion, with his wife on his arm and a clean clay pipe in his teeth. These visits in our forest state had quite the air of an event, and turned our Red Canyon into a salon. Such was the pair who ruled in the old Silverado Hotel, among the windy trees, on the mountain shoulder overlooking the whole length of Napa Valley, as the man aloft looks down on the ship's deck. There they kept house with sundry horses and fowls, and a family of sons, Daniel Webster, and I think George Washington among the number, nor did they want visitors. An old gentleman of singular stolidity and cold braid-love, I think he had crossed the plains, in the same caravan with Rufie, housed with them for a while during our stay, and they had besides a permanent lodger in the form of Mrs. Hanson's brother, Irvine Lovelands. I spell Irvine by guess, for I could get no information on the subject, just as I could never find out, in spite of many inquiries, whether or not Rufie was a contraction for Rufus. They were all cheerfully at sea about their names in that generation, and this is surely the more notable where the names are all so strange, and even the family names appear to have been coined. At one time, at least, the ancestors of all these, Alvins and Albas and Lavinas and Lovelands and Breedloves, must have taken serious counsel and found a certain poetry in these denominations. That must have been, then, their form of literature. But still times change, and their descendants, the George Washingtons and Daniel Websters, will at least be clear upon the point, and anyway, and however his name should be spelled, this Irvine Lovelands was the most unmitigated Caliban I ever knew. Our very first morning at Silverado, when we were full of business, patching up doors and windows, making beds and seats, and getting our rough lodging into shape, Irvine and his sister made their appearance together. She for neighborliness and general curiosity, he because he was working for me, to my sorrow, cutting firewood and I forget how much a day. The way that he set about cutting wood was characteristic. We were, at that moment, patching up and unpacking in the kitchen. Down he sat on one side, and down sat his sister on the other. Both were chewing pine tree gum, and he, to my annoyance, accompanied that simple pleasure with profuse expectoration. She rattled away, talking up hill and down dale, laughing, tossing her head, showing her brilliant teeth. He looked on in silence, now spitting heavily on the floor, now putting his head back and uttering a loud, discordant, joyless laugh. He had a tangle of shock hair, the color of wool. His mouth was a grin. Although as strong as a horse, he looked neither heavy nor yet adroit, only leggy, coltish, and in the road. But it was plain he was in high spirits, thoroughly enjoying his visit, and he laughed frankly whenever he failed to accomplish that we were about. This was scarcely helpful. It was even to amateur carpenters embarrassing. But it lasted until we knocked off work and began to get dinner. Then Mrs. Hanson remembered she should have been gone an hour ago, and the pair retired, and the ladies' laughter died away among the nutmegs down the path. That was Irvine's first day's work in my employment. The devil take him! The next morning he returned, and, as he was this time alone, he bestowed his conversation upon us with great liberality. He prided himself on his intelligence. Asked us if we knew the school ma'am. He didn't think much of her anyway. He had tried her, he had put the question to her. If a tree 100 feet high were to fall a foot a day, how long would it take to fall right down? She had not been able to solve the problem. She don't know nothing, he opined. He told us how a friend of his kept the school with a revolver, and chuckled mightily over that. His friend could teach school, he could. All the time he kept chewing gum and spitting. He would stand a while, looking down, and then he would toss back his shock of hair and laugh hoarsely and spit, and bring forward a new subject. A man, he told us, who bore a grudge against him, had poisoned his dog. That was a low thing for a man to do, wasn't it? It wasn't like a man that know how. But I got even with him. I poisoned his dog. His clumsy utterance, his rude, embarrassed manner, set a fresh value on the stupidity of his remarks. I do not think I ever appreciated the meaning of two words until I knew Irvine. The verb, loaf, and the noun, ove. Between them they complete his portrait. He could lounge and wriggle and rub himself against the wall, and grin and be more in everybody's way than any other two people that I ever set my eyes on. Nothing that he did became him, and yet you were conscious that he was one of your own race, that his mind was cumbrously at work, revolving the problem of existence like a quid of gum, and in his own cloudy manner enjoying life and passing judgment on his fellows. Above all things, he was delighted with himself. You would not have thought it from his uneasy manners and troubled, struggling utterance, but he loved himself to the marrow, and was happy and proud like a peacock on a rail. His self-esteem was, indeed, the one joint in his harness. He could be got to work, and even kept at work by flattery. As long as my wife stood over him, crying out how strong he was, so long exactly he would stick to the matter in hand, and the moment she turned her back or ceased to praise him, he would stop. His physical strength was wonderful, and to have a woman stand by and admire his achievements warmed his heart like sunshine. Yet he was as cowardly as he was powerful, and felt no shame in owning to the weakness. Something was once wanted from the crazy platform over the shaft, and he at once refused to venture there. "Did not like," as he said, "foolin' round them kind of places," and let my wife go instead of him, looking on with a grin. Vanity, where it rules, is usually more heroic, but Irvine steadily approved himself and expected others to approve him. Rather looked down upon my wife and decidedly expected her to look up to him on the strength of his superior prudence. Yet the strangest part of the whole matter was perhaps this, that Irvine was as beautiful as a statue. His features were in themselves perfect. It was only his cloudy, uncouth, and coarse expression that disfigured them. So much strength residing in so spare a frame was proof sufficient of the accuracy of his shape. He must have been built somewhat after the pattern of Jack Sheppard, but the famous housebreaker, we may be certain, was no lout. It was by the extraordinary powers of his mind, no less than by the vigor of his body, that he broke his strong prison with such imperfect implements, turning the very obstacles to service. Irvine, in the same case, could have sat down and spat and grumbled curses. He had the soul of a fat sheep, but, regarded as an artist's model, the exterior of a Greek god. It was a cruel thought to persons less favored in their birth, that this creature, endowed, to use the language of theatres, with extraordinary means, should so manage to misemploy them that he looked ugly and almost deformed. It was only by an effort of abstraction, after many years, that you discovered what he was. By playing on the oaf's conceit and standing closely over him, we got a path made round the corner of the dump to our door, so that we could come and go with decent ease. And he even enjoyed the work, for in that there were boulders to be plucked up bodily, bushes to be uprooted, and other occasions for athletic display. But cutting wood was a different matter. Anybody could cut wood, and besides, my wife was tired of supervising him, and had other things to attend to. And in short, days went by, and Irvine came daily and talked and lounged and spat, but the firewood remained intact, as sleepers on the platform or growing trees upon the mountainside. Irvine as a woodcutter we could tolerate, but Irvine as a friend of the family at so much a day was too bald an imposition, and at length, on the afternoon of the 4th or 5th day of our connection, I explained to him as clearly as I could the light in which I had grown to regard his presence. I pointed out to him that I could not continue to give him a salary for spitting on the floor, and his expression, which came after a good many others, at last penetrated his obdurate wits. He rose at once and said, if that was the way he was going to be spoke to, he reckoned he would quit, and, no one interposing, he departed. So far so good, but we had no firewood. The next afternoon I strolled down to Rufus and consulted him on the subject. It was a very droll interview. in the large, bare north room of the Silverado Hotel, Mrs. Hanson's patchwork on a frame, and Rufy and his wife and I, and the oaf himself, all more or less embarrassed. Rufy announced there was nobody in the neighborhood but Irvine who could do a day's work for anybody. Irvine, thereupon, refused to have any more to do with my service. He wouldn't work no more for a man as had spoke to him's I had done. I found myself on the point of that last humiliation, driven to besiege the creature whom I had just dismissed with insult. But I took the high hand in despair, said there must be no talk of Irvine coming back unless matters were to be differently managed, that I would rather chop firewood for myself than be fooled. And in short, the Hansons being eager for the lad's hire, I so imposed upon them, with merely affected resolution, that they ended by begging me to re-employ him again, on a solemn promise that he should be more industrious. The promise, I am bound to say, was kept. We soon had a fine pile of firewood at our door, and if Caliban gave me the cold shoulder and spared me his conversation, I thought none the worse of him for that, nor did I find my days much longer for the deprivation. The leading spirit of the family was, I am inclined to fancy, Mrs. Hanson. Her social brilliancy somewhat dazzled the others, and she had more of the small change of sense. It was she who faced Kalmar, for instance, and perhaps if she had been alone, Kalmar would have had no rule with her doors. Rufy, to be sure, had a fine, sober, open-air attitude of mind, seeing the world without exaggeration, perhaps we may even say without enough. For he lacked, along with the others, that commercial idealism which puts so high a value in time and money. Sanity itself is a kind of convention. Perhaps Rufy was wrong, but, looking on life plainly, he was unable to perceive that croquet or poker were in any way less important than, for instance, mending his wagon. Even his own profession, hunting, was dear to him mainly as a sort of play, even that he would have neglected had it not appealed to his imagination. His hunting suit, for instance, had cost, I should be afraid to say how many bucks, the currency in which he paid his way. It was all befringed, after the Indian fashion, and it was dear to his heart. The pictorial side of his daily business was never forgotten. He was even anxious to stand for his picture in those buckskin hunting clothes, and I remember how he once warmed almost into enthusiasm, his dark blue eyes growing perceptibly larger as he planned the composition in which he should appear. With the horns of some real big bucks and dogs, and a camp on the creek. Creek or stream, he meant by that. There was no trace in Irvine of his woodland poetry. He did not care for hunting, nor yet for buckskin suits. He had never observed scenery. The world, as it appeared to him, was almost obliterated by his own great grinning figure in the foreground, Caliban Malvolio. And it seems to me as if, in the persons of these brothers-in-law, we had the two sides of rusticity fairly well represented. The hunter living really in nature, the clodhopper living merely out of society. The one bent up in every corporal agent to capacity in one pursuit, doing at least one thing keenly and thoughtfully, and thoroughly alive to all that touches it. The other in the inert and bestial state, walking in a faint dream and taking so dim an impression of the myriad sides of life that he is truly conscious of nothing but himself. It is only in the fastnesses of nature, forests, mountains, and the back of man's beyond, that a creature endowed with 5 senses can grow up into perfection of this crass and earthy vanity. In towns or the busier countryside, he is roughly reminded of other men's existence, and if he learns no more, he learns at least to fear contempt. But Irvine had come scatheless through life, conscious only of himself, of his great strength and intelligence, and, in the silence of the universe, to which he did not listen, dwelling with delight on the sound of his own thoughts.